Hey there, this is Tyler from Equus Law. We're here with Tom White from Equus Law as well, and Jordan from Black Box Consulting. And we're here for another episode of Stories from the Bench.
Yeah, this is cool. This is going to be our second one. First one was well received. So we're here with Tom White, we just went over this, 10 years as a prosecutor, 20 years as a common pleas court judge, and now 13 years in private practice. So I'm not that good at math, but quick math says 43 years of experience, knows a thing or two, seen a thing or two, and we're here to hear about some of that.
Yep.
And the younger lawyers like to say, I've forgotten more law than they'll ever know. So
Probably true. Probably true. The laws don't change that much most of the time.
Well, actually, the legislature, if they would take a couple years off and let us catch up, that would be nice, because sometimes they're very, very active depending upon what the issue or the flavor of the day or the year is. And the difficulty with the legal community is, of course, we have to take the laws that they pass, and then we have to apply them to real people's lives. And that's one of the challenges that especially a judge has. You know, you can, I remember back in the 90s, insurance law was a big deal, and the legislature was trying to limit liability of certain professionals like doctors and et cetera. And so they would pass a law, and then the Supreme Court would say, no, that's not constitutional, so they passed another one. And it was kind of like a real back and forth there. And the problem is that as a judge, I remember one time there was a law that had a sentence in it that was 126 words.
Wow.
That's like three paragraphs.
Okay.
Not quite, but.
And Dave Hall, who's now one of our county commissioners again, was a state representative. And so I called him up and I said, Dave, I know you don't read these things before you vote on them, but 126 word sentence. Now, I'm a pretty bright guy. I went to law school and everything. But by the time I get to the end of a 126 word sentence, I forget how it begins. And I'm supposed to apply this to real people's lives. And Dave said, yeah, well, we don't write them. The Legislative Service Commission writes them. But that is a bane of a lot of lawyers and judges, and that is trying to keep up with the law. Because not only do you have the legislature amending and making new laws, et cetera, especially in the criminal law field. Criminal law field, back when they printed the revised code, would be like 3 or 4 volumes with supplements, et cetera, started off about 1 foot and then 18 inches and then 2 feet of shelf space, because the legislature was always saying, well, we need to address this issue, we need to address this issue. Of course, they would not necessarily figure out how changing this law might affect another related law. And so that's something that was continually a challenge and work through. And I remember several times thinking, boy, if they just let us catch up. Because then you have various courts that are interpreting those laws, and you have 12 courts of appeals and 1 Supreme Court, and it takes like 3 to 5 years for the Supreme Court to get an issue. And so when you're dealing with real people's lives, that's
unrealistic.
You can tell that's kind of a bone
in
and contention from a retired trial judge here.
Well, that's kind of a good segue into something we kind of want to talk about today: the difference between being a judge versus being an attorney.
Sure.
I mean, that's a great. You're competing there a little bit, but you've done both of them. So let's talk about that.
Well, and my primary issue was my age. At the time, I was elected prosecuting attorney when I was 30. And then I was appointed and then elected a common pleas court judge at the age of 33. And the first thing when I was appointed and elected prosecuting attorney was I had this incredible baby face, and I couldn't get anybody to take me seriously. So the first thing I did was grow a beard, because it made me look.
We were just talking about that.
That's smart.
It made me look more serious.
Yeah.
Made me look older. And the same thing, because those are incredibly young ages to take on that amount of a responsibility in a community.
Yeah.
So it was very young.
Did you feel ready for it?
No.
Either one of them?
I mean, yeah, the prosecutor's office, I'd served as an assistant for a period of time, had a lot of trial work. So actually moving in was a fairly easy transition. My prosecuting attorney, Bob Hines, involved me in a lot of decision making, et cetera. So that wasn't a big deal, but it was kind of a real culture shock when you go from being an attorney, be it a attorney in public service like a prosecutor or in private practice, and then all of a sudden you're a judge. There's a retired judge, I'm not sure if he's still around or not, John Milligan from the 5th District Court of Appeals in Canton. And he used to tell me that it's a real culture shock because the way that you are elected a judge is that you're well known, you're likable, you slap people on the back, you kiss babies, everything goes to the political process, and all of a sudden you are judge, and you have to cut yourself off from all that, especially in a small community. I couldn't go, like a lot of my friends were lawyers. I couldn't go to lunch with a lawyer because then if another lawyer or another person's client saw that, all of a sudden this attorney has it in with the judge. Because in a small community, you are the face of the law as a judge.
Is that just an optics thing, or is there actual ethical rules around that?
There's a lot. There's a thing called the Code of Judicial Conduct that is drummed into you from the first day that you become a judge. Not only do you have to avoid anything that's improper, called impropriety, okay, but you have to avoid even the appearance of something that's improper. And that's difficult in a
it's a pretty
small
relative
community.
thing, depending.
It is, but here's the thing. Oftentimes, when you are deciding a case, when you are deciding a dispute between two of your fellow citizens, your word, unless you're reversed by the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, which doesn't happen very often, is the law. And therefore, that's a tremendous responsibility, not only that you're doing the right thing, but you're seen to be doing the right thing. And that's a little bit mind-bending. I went from calling the Holmes County Courthouse the Sandstone Palace to calling it the Sandstone Prison after I'd been there for about 20 years, because it is a very isolating experience, and it's something that I believe that judges in judicial training do a lot better job of that now. There are mentors, et cetera. I was just kind of thrown into the mix upon my appointment by the governor. I remember calling a judge who I respected, Judge Mark Wiest up in Worcester, who recently retired, and said, "How do you do this job?" He said, "2 things, Tom." He said, "Number 1, always look like you know what you're doing, and eventually the right thing will dawn on you."
Yeah.
That was really, really
like
good advice. The
Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, the second one was, listen, I know you're young. You were an aggressive prosecutor. You're not going to mind sending people to prison, but eventually that will wear on you. And it did. About 15 years in, my wife was talking to me. She says, "You're getting burned out." And I said, well, I haven't lost a night's sleep for sending somebody to prison. Sending young people to prison eventually does wear on you if you are human at all.
Yeah.
Because it is such a waste. It is such a waste. So, and that was one of the first things that got me thinking about maybe retiring. And then, of course, my son, Chris, who had a real job, he was a teacher, decides to go to law school, something that he has yet to explain to me, why he did that. Because he saw what a lawyer's family has to put up with, okay? And so I never figured that either of my sons would be interested in the law, but he decides to go to law school, and about halfway through law school, he says, "Why don't you retire and let's practice law together?" And I said, "That sounds like fun." It was just going to be him and me, small, what's called boutique practice, no staff. We just kind of do things on our own. And now Equus Law Group has been, thanks to Chris's leadership, has been just tremendously blessed. I don't have any idea right now how many lawyers. I think we have 6 offices.
13 attorneys, 6 offices, 34, 35 staff, something.
Yeah, so it's really, and Chris has done that. He's as the leader of the firm, I'm still just the guy that they trot out in front of judges and juries every once in a while because I know how they think, which is the value of working with juries and being a judge for those 20 years or so. And what judges and juries think are sometimes totally at odds with what the lawyers think is important in a case.
Yeah.
And so that experience is kind of my...
That makes me curious. Do you have any examples of that?
Sure. Lawyers are taught to think like lawyers, okay? When you first go to law school, number one, it's not like being in high school or undergraduate where you're kind of a smart person. You don't have to work real hard. You can get good grades and not work hard. All of a sudden, you're in
You're
with
not wrong.
a group of very bright people. Many of them have advanced degrees, and you realize it is hard work. Plus, it is a totally different language. And I like to tell people law school isn't that hard once you learn to read, write, think, talk all over again, called thinking like a lawyer, which is thinking logically, breaking things down, looking for authority to back up your argument, understanding what the other side's argument is. It's a mind-bending experience, but once you get used to it, you can speak the language. But I used to teach at the University of Akron Law School a course called Trial Advocacy, which is basically we took a semester and we broke down how to try a jury trial in class. And ended up, they had two, at the time, classrooms that they made over into courtrooms. So we would have mock trials. And the students would learn how to try jury trials. And I never forget, it was a senior level course. So these people had been in college like 7 years, and they had a whole boatload of student debt. And all of a sudden, here's a real live judge, okay? And I go, well, the first thing that you're going to need to understand is that to be effective in front of a jury, you're going to have to largely forget everything you've learned in the last 3 years. And everybody just looks at me like, what does he mean? I said, and that's because jurors don't think like lawyers. The thing that every jury that I've worked with as prosecutor, as judge, or in private practice, what they are interested in is doing the right thing. So breaking things down logically, arguing about the law, etc., while that's important, that's not the main purpose of a jury trial. The main purpose of a jury trial is that the jury is your audience. And it is, in effect, since you can't bring the intersection where recreate that intersection where somebody ran a red light inside the courtroom, you're in effect using testimony, photographs, et cetera, in order to recreate the story of what happened according to your client. And that's, so in a very real way, a jury trial is competitive storytelling. And the side whose story most matches up with A, what the jurors have heard, makes most sense out of the evidence, but B, is the right thing to do, is going to be the successful side in the jury trial. So that's what I would try to teach.
Competitive storytelling.
Wow.
That's what it is, really.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, like every time I watch these documentaries or shows about stuff like that, it's like really the way you can connect to the jurors, maybe pull on their heartstrings and put them in that situation so they want to do the right thing. I feel like that's...
Well, just about we were talking about maybe doing a podcast on legal movies, okay?
Yep.
The thing that is shared by all good legal movies is a dramatic final argument where the attorney is connecting or attempting to connect on an emotional level with the jury, okay? Atticus Finch, knowing that this Alabama jury is probably going to convict his client, but saying, for God's sake, do the right thing, And he's trying to get, and as it was, instead of returning a verdict within 15 minutes, which is what he expected, they stayed out for 4 hours, which in the book, he actually counts as a little bit of a victory. before they convict his client, who is obviously, according to the story, is not guilty. Okay, so that's the drama, the storytelling. That's what's really, really interesting about a good trial.
Yeah.
You have two really good lawyers who realize who their audience is. All too often, lawyers get bound up in arguing with each other. And while you need to do that because the other side has a contrary view, the other side is not your audience. It's the judge or the jury that's your audience. You have to keep that in mind. So if you give them a reason to dislike you, they're less likely to believe your story.
Right.
Okay. So it's one of the main things that I learned as a judge is especially, and I loved working with juries. Not that I agreed with every jury verdict that I had. I would go back and talk with jurors after the verdict. And before then, they're not allowed to talk to anybody. They're kind of a black box, kind of like, you feed a lot of stuff in it and they give you something out. But I'd go back and I'd start by saying, listen, is there any way that we can make your jury service better for you? And don't tell me about the hard chairs, because the chairs are hard so you don't fall asleep because the lawyers are boring. Okay? But then they talk about, their deliberations and what they thought was important and what they thought was convincing. And so, I've got a 20-year database on how people think about what the right thing is.
Interesting.
So what have you found in 20 years?
There is an inherent sense of morality among the largely Appalachian, small town, country, southeastern Ohio, central Ohio juries that I've worked with. I did not work a lot with jurors in major metropolitan areas. While I was assigned there, I had several. The people who were like I grew up with are essentially conservative. If it's a civil case, they're not going to make anybody rich because bad things happen to good people. And in personal injury cases, oftentimes, we'll get a lawyer from Cleveland who says, oh, this case is worth this many zeros, on the end of a check. And I'll say, no, it's not. You're going to get your medical bills, you're going to get your expenses, you may get a little bit of pain and suffering. And every time I would tell them that, they'd say, no, Judge, I'm going to grab the brass ring, I'm going to get the $1 million verdict. And they would walk out disappointed. As a matter of fact, during jury selection, many people would say, listen, bad things happen to good people. I wouldn't even sue if I was in the plaintiff's position in this case. And so most of my experience with it is very conservative folks, but still folks who want to do the right thing. One thing that's been interesting to me is going from prosecutor to judge to every once in a while doing criminal defense work. And if you get an acquittal, it's because you've done a good job with a jury group that is probably inclined to think, well, he had to have done something or he wouldn't have been here. Okay? The defendant would have had to done, and besides, sheriffs and prosecutors generally aren't reelected if they charge absolutely innocent people.
Right.
Okay? And so it's a process of trying to get the jurors to think what is fair and that a not guilty verdict can be the right thing to do. Okay? And that depends upon a lot of the facts of the case, the witnesses, et cetera. And so trial lawyers, really good trial lawyers, will do what's called set a theme for a case. Okay? Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
There's a very good criminal defense attorney who represented a man who was charged with murder. The victim was a young man who, along with several friends, was in a cornfield throwing tomatoes and paintballing cars as they went past the cornfield.
I remember. I don't know where this is going to go, but I remember this story growing up very vividly.
Yeah,
it was a case with Amish connections, and anything dealing with the Amish and crime in the community I grew up with is big news, okay? Especially if it's a murder case, because murder draws for some reason. This guy got tomatoed, got pelted with paintballs, got out, got mad at the kids, goes home, gets his shotgun, comes back, and ends up shooting and killing a young man. The defense attorney in that case, understanding that why are you shooting a kid? Okay, number one, tried to create some doubt about how the shooting happened. In other words, he brought out something that the prosecutor really didn't explain too well. He brought out that from where the shot was taken down on the roadway up into the cornfield there was about a 5 or 6 foot high bank. Okay? And he had the guy demonstrate with his own shotgun in front of the jury what he was trying to do. And his testimony was, I was trying to scare them. I was trying to fire over their heads. Well, according to his testimony, he didn't know about the bank because it was dark. And therefore, when he demonstrated the angle, okay, there was actually a photograph in the local paper about that. From that part of the trial, it gave the jurors an alternative. Right. In other words, this may have been an accident. He may have been acting negligently, just without due regard to who might be in the cornfield, but he wasn't doing it intentionally. And the prosecutor was saying he intentionally shot a young person. That's what made it murder. Wow. So number one, he brought out this fact, and number two, from the beginning of the trial through the end, his theme was, this is a homicide. This is not a murder. There will not be evidence that convinces you beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard for a conviction, that my client intended to shoot anybody. It's a homicide. As a matter of fact, he asked for what's called a lesser included offense. In killings, there's everything from aggravated murder to manslaughter to voluntary manslaughter to involuntary manslaughter to what he was aiming for, which is called negligent homicide, which is usually used for hunters who, somebody ends up getting shot and killed but there was no intent. It's just thought the guy was a deer or, wasn't careful about where he was aiming. And that was just very artfully done throughout the trial. This is a homicide, but it's not a murder. And so the jury had the option of finding him guilty of murder or negligent homicide. Now, there's another thing called manslaughter that would have fit. And it's a type of manslaughter where under a sudden urge of passion or anger, you take the life of somebody else. Usually used where, husband comes home and finds spouse in bed with another person, right. And
So nothing premeditated.
Nothing premeditated.
Right.
The prosecutor didn't want that. I asked him very specifically, do you want manslaughter? No, I want to force the jury into either convicting or not convicting of murder. Well, the jury went out. They deliberated, and they have to be unanimous in their verdict. And it was, I believe, 10-2 for conviction, but they could not come to a decision on murder. So the law says that if you cannot decide a greater crime, then you go on and see if there's enough evidence for the lower crime. And they all convicted him of negligent homicide. Negligent homicide is a first-degree misdemeanor, carries 6 months in jail. The guy had already been in jail waiting trial for 6 months. So basically, he was released. And that did not leave a lot. And here's the thing. I said I go back and I talk to jurors. I didn't even get a chance to say anything. And the foreman of the jury says, where was the manslaughter? And I said, number one, how'd you find out about the manslaughter? Well, we read the paper. And I said, but you're not supposed to read the paper during the trial. I told you guys that like 3 or 4 times. Yeah. We read the paper. They said, we would have convicted of manslaughter in 15 minutes. And I said, well, the prosecutor made a decision not to give you that option.
So it was a strategy that paid off for him.
It was a strategy that paid off for the defense. The defense had two very good tactics. Number one, an alternative, less horrible explanation for how the shooting happened. And number two, a really good theme to their story. This is a homicide, but it's not a murder. And
I don't even know if I can ask you this. Well, what was your opinion on it?
I think he should have had the manslaughter.
Yeah.
I think that he was a guy that if you knew him, he had a real, what most people call anger management issue. Okay. And for all kinds of reasons I won't go into. But, the postscript was, I remember reading that verdict, giving him a sentence saying, that means you're going to be released either today or tomorrow, whenever his 6 months ran. But I said, the jury has given you a gift, and you need to take advantage of this gift with regard to your future life. Well, it's not a year later that he has failed to pay somebody, and they get a judgment against him, and they're going to sell his house. And in the Walmart, he runs into the guy who he owes money to, and he starts threatening his life. And there happen to be two deputy sheriffs in the next aisle over who hear everything. And he went to prison for that, and he died in prison. So he didn't take advantage of that opportunity that the jury had afforded him. So it's interesting how I think there's a saying of what goes around comes around. And I'll still run into people who were either on that jury or have very, very definite opinions that, the verdict was right.
Yeah.
Those kids deserved what they got because they were, doing what they were doing. And other folks who think it was a horrible miscarriage of justice.
I remember hearing about that as a kid. That was probably when I was in, middle school. Must have been what?
Thanks for making me feel old, Jordan.
I'm sorry. The point being, I was young and kind of heard just bits and pieces and didn't process it or think about it that much. But I remember hearing people say, this guy got away with murder. He got off with nothing. And now hearing, hey, this was actually a much more nuanced thing that happened here. It wasn't just black and white. It was this kind of weird middle thing that they cut out, and then it became lesser. That's very interesting to me.
Well, and quite honestly, you talk about the reaction in the community, and then you talk about media. My wife's uncle was a salesman in the Pacific Rim. And he calls her during the middle of this trial and says, I'm in Beijing, China, and there's an English language newspaper that's covering this trial in Holmes County. Yeah. So it was an international story. And that's one of the difficulties when you're talking about reading in the media about a court case. Okay? Very, very difficult to pick up the nuances of what's actually going on in the case if all you're hearing is 30 seconds of testimony of Johnny Depp and and then this is what his lawyer's telling it is what his but that's the nature of the media, because trials are not done in sound bites. Right. They're developed like any good story. So
that might be a good title for this episode. Trials are not done in sound bites.
No,
I like
not.
it. I was going to go with something more along the lines of Johnny Depp, with Johnny Depp in there somewhere, but I like yours better.
Yeah.
Speaking of,
did you watch any of that, Tom? As a guy who has his life in law, do you pay any attention to things like that?
Not the Depp case, because I thought if those people were not celebrities, that would not have been.
Yeah.
That was about
Exactly
who the
right.
people were, not what happened between them. But I will tell you that something before you folks and many folks in the audience might not remember this. The trial of the century was supposedly the O.J. Simpson case. Mm-hmm. We were trying a case in which a couple guys were accused of raping a woman. And the Simpson case, which I think took 6 months to try. And no, I didn't follow every day of that, because there was just a lot of bickering and arguing, and the judge really didn't have good control of the courtroom. It was just a spectacle. It was a circus. But the verdict was going to come in while we were trying this case. And it was going to come in right after lunch, and the jurors had gone to lunch, and they sent me a request. They said, Judge, could we get a radio and could we listen to the Simpson verdict before we come back in? And I checked with the lawyers. Nobody had a problem with it. So, yeah, we did that because they wanted to do that. Well, of course, the verdict was not guilty. Well, the alleged victim, who was over at the prosecutor's office waiting to try after she was waiting to testify, heard the verdict, figured nobody was going to believe her if they didn't believe all the evidence against Simpson in her viewpoint, and she ran out of the prosecutor's office.
Oh, jeez.
And they lost her. And so the prosecutor comes up and says, Judge, can we have a little bit longer break? We're looking for the alleged victim to come testify.
Wow.
The police department found her in a bar, and she had just been chugging alcoholic beverages. And so they brought her up. She was under subpoena. And by the way, a subpoena is a court command usually to show up and testify, give testimony, okay? And you're not supposed to show up drunk.
Yeah.
If you do,
That seemed like a given.
that's called contempt of court. Well, she comes in, and they kind of put her on the stand. We don't have the jury there. And she literally says, Judge, I'm not think as you drunk I am. And I said, okay, ma'am, why don't you go have a seat? And I said, listen, she's obviously intoxicated, in no shape to testify. You want me to put her in jail and dry her out overnight, and we'll start again tomorrow? And the prosecutor said, no, I'll make sure she's here tomorrow. But it so shook her that it shook her testimony even the next day, and it resulted in an acquittal because, and the jury didn't know anything about her reaction to the Simpson verdict. But media can actually affect what's going on in a courtroom.
That's wild.
In a courtroom.
That'd be a good title for this too. Judge, I'm not as think as you drunk.
That's what she told me.
That's a couple good ones here.
Wow.
That's what she told me.
I think that's a good place to wrap. That's some good stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it was great.
Well, plenty more where that came from. So we will revisit. Sometime I'd like to talk about good prosecutors that I've worked with.
Yeah.
So we can do that some other time. If
Yeah.
you like.
Next episode.
Episode 3.
Yep.
So
Thanks, Tom.
great.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.